Hi, welcome to the bathtub. Where in 2024, if you hear this music, and we stop it, even though they can't really sue us, I mean, they might, who knows? And you see this cool T-shirt, which is from our friend the Ferbers. They did this lovely T-shirt. Then you know that this is an episode of the first 2024 episode of the short story Roundabout. It's one of our patent pending theme shows, which is owned by us, and will sue the hell out of you if you even think about trying to use it. And especially Tweety. Tweety, we're coming for you in 2024. You and Rudy Giuliani. You're first on our list. We're doing the special Christmas. It's a Christmas post-Christmas roundabout because I read a lot of short stories over Christmas. And don't forget, as I mentioned before, I don't know if you can see it really clearly. Here's my cool T-shirt, International Bathing Alliance. That's not for sale. There's only one in the world. No one's going to get one except me. But you can get one of these for free. It's a certificate of bathing excellence. All you have to do is tell me a name. Give me a name. It can be a pseudonym. You don't even have to give me your real name. A location. I put you on a map. I send you an e-copy of this beautiful certificate with your name on it. This is Boris Johnson's. Boris Johnson, I made him my bathing buddy. You can give it to people you don't like. You don't have to like them. You can just, because it's free. So you can give it to people you like. You don't like them. Doesn't matter at all. We're doing a few stories. We have what we do in the short story roundabout is instead of doing like one book, I usually have 2 or 3 books of stories I'm usually reading when I don't know what I want to read that morning, and so that's what it is. And I forgot when I was doing the previous show was about how we went with our how we did with our 12 Days of Christmas challenge to ourselves. We basically put a stack of totally pointless books to read for fun. And one of the books I put on that I didn't really finish. The only one I almost got a little bored with the Moorcock near the end, but it was still I still love Michael Moorcock. I just find the Elric books the least interesting of all his books. I was reading, and I'd planned to finish reading this kind of compilation of Justice League of Americas when Denny O'Neil took over, probably in the early 70s. Late 60s, early 70s. And it's called Last Survivor of Earth and includes all sorts of stuff. And I got about 2/3 of the way through. Denny O'Neil writes the first 4 or 5 issues. And I did enjoy, I liked Denny O'Neil. He had a kind of fun take on all the old superheroes. And then the rest of the writers were all good. And Mike Frederick takes over. But it just lost that kind of little charm that I was getting out of rereading old Denny O'Neil comics. So I gave up on that one. However, what I did do, let me see if I can find the one I'm reading now. I think I'm at number 3, book 2. I think I'm at book 2 then. So then I decided what other comics would I read, particularly late at night, and you can use the light, which is kind of cool. And let me see if I can find this is so, you can see how well I planned these. I read Alan Moore's Saga the Swamp Thing. I read volume 1, and I'm about halfway through volume 2 at this point. And I've talked about Alan Moore in the past. I didn't read comics while Alan Moore was writing. I didn't like The Watchmen when it came out. I remember I was living in London, and I was at a friend's house, and everyone was saying, this is the greatest comics of all time. And I found them kind of boring. So I never really gave Alan Moore a chance. But I'm really enjoying his take on the old Swamp Things. I consider those short stories because they're all about 20 pages long, and they're sort of episodic. And he takes over the old Len Wein, Bernie Wrights, and Swamp Things, which I think are the early 70s. This is probably the 80s. I'm sure these probably come along in the 80s. Don't quote me on anything, unless you really want to make a fool of yourself. I don't know when these comics originally came out. I want to say they came out in the 80s. But the Len Wein, Bernie Wrightson comics I loved, and this is sort of a fun take on it. And he's got some artists on here whose work I don't know. Art by Stephen Bissett, John Totleben, Sean McManus, Rick Veitch, Alfredo Alcala, Ron Randall, and Bernie Wrightson, the great Bernie Wrightson. Anyway, it has all these different artists. I really like the way they do these comics, and I like Alan Moore's scripts. They're fun. They're like little horror stories, and the Swamp Thing's involved in them all. So anyway, I'm probably going to keep reading. I got 3 or 4 of these omnibuses on sale. Like they're always like when they're on sale, they're $2-3, and I'm reading those sometimes before I go to bed. So that's been a great thing to put on the short story Roundabout. The thing about the short story Roundabout is you don't want to read. You get a little the same writer over and over and over again. It's nice to make up short story writers. That's my feeling anyway. We've continued reading Fancies and Goodnights, the great John Collier. You don't get any greater than John Collier. I really enjoy the hell out of this guy. I just read the last one I read. Again, we're reading our way backwards. This is a stupid idea, but it makes sense to me. We're reading them backwards because I've read, usually when I reread an old collection of stories, I read from the beginning. And I often don't reread all the way through to the end. So I've been reading all the way backwards, about 300 pages backwards into it. I read a story which I vaguely remember reading called Season of Mist. I'll just read the opening paragraph. I was ready for anything when I came to the town of X. It was already late in the year. Dead leaves crawled like crabs over the asphalt of the deserted esplanade. Winds raced along the corridors of the larger hotels, barging into the wrong rooms. It is at such a place and at such a season that one finds the desperate grass widow or young things whose natural credulity snaps starvingly at the grossest counterfeit. It's about a guy who goes around to beachfront holiday resorts picking up women. And he gets from one relationship into another. This is a hilarious one. I'm pretty sure I read it. He goes into a bar. He meets this girl. He decides to tell her he's been looking for her all his life. He's instantly in love with her. He goes to dinner. He comes back. And he finds out there's 2. They're twins. So he falls in love. He tells one woman he loves her, and then he goes off. He changes his coat, and his hairstyle. He comes back, and he tells the other sister he loves her. It's only 4 pages, and it takes it through this whole history of love and infidelity and loss, and the guy just goes through it. I don't want to tell you any more than that, but every story is a hoot in John Collier, and they're all a little different from each other. Sometimes they're fantastic, sometimes they're just comic, sometimes they've got a murder involved, and so forth. I also, because of the Collier, I've often heard of Saki's stories were similar to John Collier, and that he was influenced by the work of Saki, whose other name was H.H. Munro. I think it was Hector Munro. His father was in the civil service, like Orwell. I think he spent his childhood in Burma or somewhere like that and traveled around the world. I just read the Wikipedia thing, and I probably forgot it, or imperfectly remember it. His mother died when she was in childbirth because she was attacked by a cow somewhere in India. It charged her and killed her. Anyway, I'd never read the stories. I'd heard that they were good. I can see this reason people compare him to Collier. He doesn't do as many fantastic stories. They tend to be more comic stories on middle-class, stuffy Edwardian characters and families and well-off families. They're really a lot of fun. They like Collier. What is very similar is they're all very short. They're perfect for a bathtub, especially if you're in a hurry or you've got something on your mind. And each story is just kind of ridiculous, and you have to finish it when you start it. There's so many good stories. There's occasionally there'll be a kind of dark or monstrous child who does something horrible to the adults, and the ants in these characters are always horrible. The one story I remember is kind of sticks out of my memory is The Unrest Cure. It's one of the longer stories. I think it's 8 pages. It's about some middle-class guy who's really unhappy, and he's nervous, he's sick, he feels uncomfortable, and his nephew comes along and says, your life is just too easy going. You need some stress in your life. And the kid says, what you should do is get involved with the church. And he says, you should be, I'm going to let the bishops coming, the Catholic bishops coming to town. I remember I think they're Catholics. They're coming to town, and I'll make sure you're their kind of intermediary, and they'll stay here, and they're really going to be a pain. So they show up like 2 days later, and the first thing they do is they come in and they say, look, we're going to have a pogrom. We're going to kill all the Jews in the town. It comes out of nowhere. And the guy starts stressing out because he's got a Jewish neighbor who's coming over for dinner the next day or something. And this guy says the bishop and all the other Catholics are out in the bushes, and they're waiting to go all through town to kill all the Jews. And we're going to have a pogrom. And the guy says, well, we only have like 20 people like that in town. It goes on and on. It turns out, obviously, that it was obvious near the end that the nephew has set up this horrific nightmare that stresses this guy out so that he can wake up from his complacency a bit. And then all these people, there's no one really out there in the woods, and there's nobody. The bishop isn't really hiding out there waiting to kill people. Anyway, it's a very funny, weird story, and I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it. There's a similar sense of humor, The Toys of Peace, where these parents want to get their kids, instead of getting their kids violent toys, they try to get them toys like about raising farm animals and having laboratories where they find the cure for cancer, and toys that are teaching you to be peaceful and do good things. But of course, the kids have already learned to turn every one of those things into horrible. They're like putting wounds on them and putting patches over their eyes, and they're giving them guns. These doctors in the research overcoats are being given machine guns. Anyway, they're very short, very funny. I'm enjoying the Saki collection. I'll read some more. Finally, I said I was going to do this. I 2 or 3 years ago, I started reading Weird Tales stuff. I got introduced by reading on H.P. Lovecraft anthologies. I started reading S.T. Joshi's really excellent introductions to a lot of these writers and some of his biographies. And one of the writers I started to read was Algernon Blackwood. And he really stuck in my mind for a lot of reasons. They're very dark, moody, very atmospheric. You could see the influence on people like Lovecraft. And I've been about halfway through Mike Ashley's excellent biography. I think it's called Starlight Man. I think you can only get it. You may be able to get it on Kindle and email or e-books. A really excellent biography by a good critic who loves this subject. Anyway, this is a guy who was very successful at the turn of the century. Wrote lots of books pretty quickly, lots of short stories, many of which were influential, particularly on the horror writers of the following generations, much like Arthur Machen. In fact, he and Arthur Machen kind of passed each other in the same time. I love all these stories. The Willows, I reread The Willows. I read about a third of this book, but The Willows is the most famous one, where it's about these people out in the country, somewhere in, I think they're in, somewhere in, they're on the Danube somewhere, and there's a flood, and they go through this area which is pretty much abandoned with just tons of willow trees, and they start to feel like they're reaching this conjunction of kind of spiritual realms. It's kind of an impossible book to describe. You don't have a lot of violence in the Blackwood stories. You don't have a lot of monsters. You just have intimations of horrible things happening, and I like him. I'm going to keep reading these. I haven't read the John Silence book stories. I read one of them a few years ago, but I've got the John Silence collection out. That's his spiritual detective or his mystical detective. Anyway, the Blackwood stuff is very interesting, and I also ordered some of his other books, particularly The Centaurs. Received a lot of good press over the years. He was a writer who was very, very influential in his lifetime, particularly in the turn of the 20th century. And he's kind of forgotten now, except for these occasional horror stories that show up in anthologies. Okay, well, cheers. Pure mountain water. Happy bathing. Read unproductively as much as possible. All of these stories and all these collections have entertained me a lot on the short story merry-go-round, short story roundabout. Have a great new year, 2024. We're going to completely do nothing useful in this show. We're going to do nothing useful, just stuff that we like to read. Stay safe. Bye.